Welcome everyone to talk number 4 in our Carmelite series. As a note, we have one more on Thursday, and then we will have our final meditation on Friday. So we have 4 more days of morning meditations, and we have, after this, one more talk on Thursday. Just like the other talks, I'll do an introductory reflection on the topic. And tonight's topic is Teresa of Avila and the process of liberation. And then after that, we'll open it up for a share. I have leading questions, but my questions don't have to lead us unless they are really helpful or necessary. There are many parts of the retreat I led in Spain, and maybe I'll lead that retreat again sometime, that remain etched upon my heart. And one of them was at the monastery in Medina del Campo. So it was the second monastery that Teresa had founded. She founded 17. And the first one, St. Joseph's, right in Avila, not far from the Incarnation, she, with her cousins and other relatives, funded and built themselves. This second one, for some reason, Medina del Campo, she spent a fair amount of time in. And probably part of it was just travel and other logistics. Part of it was that it was located in a way that she could work with her other monasteries. But we, through no surprise, happened chanced onto this private tour. They supposedly were going to have hours that you could enjoy the monastery, not walk through yourself, but have something of a guided through certain parts of it. And this was one of the locations that their signage that I found ahead of time as I was preparing for the retreat was wrong. And we got there outside the building. There were only 2 risks that I took, that I knew that I had done all the research possible, and we were just going to see how it goes. All the other ones, they lined up, took a lot of time, but I got the right contacts in Spanish and got everything arranged. But this was one of them. And we get outside the door, and there is the note that supposedly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. you can go in and see part of the monastery, but no one was there. And there wasn't any new posting as to whether it was canceled or not, but there was a note to call somebody if you had interest. So that's what we did. We called a man who was something of not a caretaker of the nuns in the monastery. There was a very small monastery, but he was something of a contact person, if you will. And we waited for a couple hours for him to arrive. And he gave us a remarkable tour. And while I remember many aspects, one is sitting in the chair that John and Teresa met for the first time in that monastery. But the highlight was going into what was her dedicated cell. And as Carmelites, you're probably familiar, but if you're not, the place where you dwell is considered a cell. And that comes from some of the earliest writings of the Carmelites, because the cell was seen not as a place of aesthetics, not as a place of divesting of self. It was actually framed like a cell in a hive where you gathered the divine honey. So the cell was considered the place of divine love, of banquet, of the sweetness of the communion. It wasn't, as many popularly consider it, the absence of all things, but rather the fulfillment of all things. And we were afforded the opportunity to go into the cell where she wrote quite a bit of the works that we have from her, not all of them, but quite a bit. And it was tiny and dark, ornately painted now that it's not hers anymore. And we were able to see firsthand how she wrote, what were her conditions in which she gave to us such illuminated texts. And there was just a small place for a very small oil lamp. So she was highly writing to us in the dark, in the dark. And they said that at that time when she was writing, she usually had a fair amount of pain in her body because she suffered from a lot of ailments. So I preface this before our meditation because while we were there in that cell, the energy was so palpable. And it is that very energy that I hope will be our container tonight, both for my reflection and for our share. It was so incredibly intimate with her. And while we were all clustered in there, all my retreatants and myself, I asked the man who only spoke Spanish if I could do a chant. And I did a chant that she would have chanted often. So without any of my, I don't need a lot of notation, but without any notation, I did this one chant that I knew predated her. And so it's with that intention that we begin our inquiry tonight, because the inquiry has some dynamic theological propositions to it that are worthy of your reflection later. This isn't for the academics tonight, but it's worthy of your reflection. And tonight is the opportunity, hopefully, to palpably let her guide us. And so to prepare for that, I invite you to close your eyes. And while I was going to actually play a song of one of her poems, I feel that the container of solitude will be much more potent for us tonight. So in your mind's eye, in the imagination of your heart, let's in spirit be in this tiny cell that she habited, wherein she was prolific, wherein she found repose from the many challenges of her life, wherein she communed with not exaltation and grandiosity, but with incredible simplicity. Enter this cell, not just to learn from her and have her presence, but enter it for yourself. Connect deeply with your own desires for this divine honey given by the lover. Let your work be this one act, this one choice. And let this soulful translation of one of her poems find a stirring within your own soul. When your soul was born, it was like a still ocean that had yet to experience its infinite life. God then came to the shores of our souls and gazed upon the immaculate splendor that the divine heart created. This lover then took off his clothes and dove into us. Nothing on their own have your arms ever done. The movements of your feet are caused by the waves God stirred. Life baptizes life wherever it falls. And every religion and all upon this earth is a shadow. A shadow may move, but it has no real power of its own, though it can affect the weak and frighten them, and men can use that darkness to exploit. As I found the source of all we do, as I found the source of all our desires, so humble God became. This source of being admitted, yes, I caused all things. And so in these moments, these precious moments that are so at the service of your heart and all its tender movements, let these moments open you up in some new way to our communing and share tonight. And I place myself and my words and my presence and my heart, all of me that is seen and unseen, at the service of your highest good. With that, I invite you to open your eyes. So, the title tonight is The Process of Liberation. With anyone that we esteem as being awakened or further along the path or someone to learn from, there can be pulled from their very life experience a certain process that was their process. And in its own way, it is very objectively true. And yet at the same time, it may be a process that is a unique set of beliefs, steps, foundations, and actions that paradoxically and interestingly don't conflict with other processes, and yet also don't align with them specifically as well. It's a little bit like flowers in the field. Lilies have their way of coming to their fullness and giving off their fragrance. And roses have their way, and violets have their way, and daffodils have their way. And there's a unifying movement that's happening, and that's that they're coming to their fullness, and that in the process, they seem to be in relation with the rest of the world. And as flowers oftentimes do give off their fragrance, they uplift the world as they come to their fullness. So there's a unifying model there when we talk about a process of liberation. But within that, if you were to tease out the actual steps that each of those little lineages of flowers go through, you're going to find some diversity there. You're going to find some differences. And so it is with using the concept process of liberation. I in no way, shape, or form am purporting that this is the be all end all. I shy away. It's why I haven't written any self-help books that give the action steps. Do these 5 things and you will be set free. There is some truth that can be spoken to things like that, but more often than not, they fall short because the operative agent is the one engaging them, and the very territory that one engaging encounters along the way, their responsiveness, the ways they butt up to meet themselves. So this process of liberation is something for you to just simply enjoy and pull from what is salient for you. Pull from it resonant notes. Pull from it fragrances that illumine your own process, and lay light around trying to make it like a Bible. In her opening poem, she says quite clearly that religions are simply a shadow, and a shadow has no power. And that's an interesting poem, given how much she wanted to be a daughter of the church and how much she esteemed the structure, the sacramental quality, and the dogmatic expression of the Catholic Church. So I'm going to just point out a few highlights of her life chronologically, just to set the stage, either to remind you or to inform you if you don't already know a bit of her history. She was born in 1515 on March 28th in Avila. And while you'll see pictures of Avila as this fortress town, if you have never been there, it is way smaller than what you get the impression from her writings or from anything about Avila. She talks about going far away, and far away is like a stone's throw in Avila. So at the age of 7, she attempts to run away to be a martyr. She's very, very much a Spanish Catholic. And at this time, we have a lot of upheaval and change happening in that Christian tradition. And in the Christian tradition, you have Luther, you have Calvin, you have all sorts of other influences that are striving to move back to the spirit of Christ. Aware of that, and in her belief, believing that all of these people are going to hell, who's so worried about them all going to hell, she wants to run away and be a martyr. So right away, we have an experience of her passion, of her zeal, of her willing to give her whole self for something, and of her inherent limitations because of her culture. She ends up going to a convent school. She has many brothers and sisters, but the ones she's closest to end up moving away. They move to other places for missionary kinds of ventures and things like that. It's in 1536 that she takes the habit at the Incarnation. And this is after really grappling with desiring a world of romantic pleasure. She has a few experiences that lead her towards wanting to join a monastic life. Life in the Incarnation, hopefully I'm just refreshing your memory, was very different than how we paint a picture. In this very small monastery, and I was there, it's very small, they had more than 200 women, and they were of all different backgrounds. And they observed the caste system right within the monastery walls. There was not a heavy observance of silence. There was a lot of visitation that happened with family and friends. There was a lot of talk of spirituality. And there was the devotional aspect of prayer, meditation, what we call the liturgy of the hours, and things like spiritual reading. But it was a little bit like a social commune with spiritual ideals. She was in a monastery that was of very ill repair. They suffered because they didn't have food. They had lots of leaks in their roof. They had no real way that they procured funds to better their lifestyle. So it was a rigorous life, but in tune with the times as well. So it was on November 2nd that she took the habit, and that is, she was 21 years old. It was 2 years later that she took vows. In simple vows, she got very, very, very sick and ended up going to be taken care of by her family. Had she been in solemn vows, she would have been at the disposal of the monastery. Being in simple vows, she could go and stay with her family. And her family was very influential and very affluent. You can see all around the town the influences of her family. It's one of the reasons that she was held in such great esteem, and her charism had a place to become credible because she came from a really highly esteemed family. She was, in her early years, afraid of prayer. This is huge. And I know some of you have taken my 5-week Teresa of Avila course. It's huge. She's considered this mystic of helping us understand the interior life, of being the doctor of the church that is the true genius when it comes to prayer. And she was terrified of prayer. She grew up in a culture that painted prayer as a dangerous activity and only to be undertaken by some. This was dispelled with a book that was given to her called The Spiritual Alphabet. So she returns to the practice of prayer in 44. So she is close to 30 years old when she finally assents to open herself up to the practice of prayer again. She makes pilgrimages during this time. And it was then later in 54, so 1515 to 1554, that she has her profound conversion before a statue of Christ. So she's quite a bit older. Now here it's recording that she's 39. Other accounts will say she's 43 when she has her dramatic experiences that move her from a social and a dependence on relationship and talking into a communion in silence. She herself attests that she was very much afraid of silence. And she enjoyed speaking about spirituality much more than really entering into a time of solitude. The copies of the rule, so we had our one talk that was about the rule. The copies of the rule were not readily available for everyone. And she, at this time, because of all the other upheaval in Christianity, some friends, some women friends who were nuns, showed her a copy of what was considered the original rule. And she immediately was on board for being an advocate for Carmelites to return to this eremitical, that's hermit-like, cenobitical in community kind of life. And that sets her upon her journey. I don't need to give all of the other history, but if you like chronology, I really like the translations of Kieran Kavanagh. It's much more academic. If you like the softer to-date translations, there are many authors today that kind of give more of an interpretation, but Kieran Kavanagh tries to be as literal as possible. So it's not long after that she gets the call to found monasteries. She writes her autobiography at the request of a confessor. And this autobiography ends up being the reason when she is 61, so close to her death, that she gets turned into the Inquisition. So she flies under the radar for all these years. Her autobiography, which is which is the story of her life, is the early version, the 20-year earlier version of her interior castle. She writes the Interior Castle, which is her most popular work known to us today. I know Way of Perfection and those are well known, but the Interior Castle is really crossing many boundaries. She writes that only because everybody burns, almost everybody, the story of her life because of the Inquisition. And she is only turned into the Inquisition later in her life because one of the monasteries that she founded, and affluent women joined it, who was reputed to have a lot of ecstatic experiences and to be very holy. This woman ended up not being able to do the lifestyle. And though Teresa was not judgmental of her, she didn't call her a fraud. This affluent woman ended up leaving the monastic life because she was incapable of the solitary journey that she was so reputed to be holy for. And in leaving, ends up having a grudge against Teresa of Avila and turns her in her 60s to the Inquisition. That's when then we get the rewrite of the Interior Castle. I love her story of her life. If you are inclined to get to know her, I encourage you to read that story. It's less formulaic, less systematized, a little more raw, a little more in touch with her own humanity and her experiences and grappling with what it meant and what it's about and what union with God is really about. So that brings us then to her process of liberation. Now, I share these details not because it's fun. It's fun to feel a connection with people we're going to learn something from, but I share the details because I love the opportunity for you to draw close to her in a grounded, non-romantic way. So easy in these mystics to romanticize their lives, not just from their exalted experiences, but even from their teachings. And I would like for you to understand that she was very much of her times, that she was filled with many, many fears all the way up until her time of death, that she wrestles with the politics of her time, that she herself is a business person that draws a hard line when she started her monasteries. She is one of the only founders that wrote into the constitutions. The constitutions are what is kind of the makeup of how you form the community. She's one of the only founders that, though the Carmelites are mendicant, was a strong proponent for the nuns always having solid income. She did not want the nuns to suffer and be beholden to people giving them money and or them having to get alms. She did not want that tension. So she's a shrewd business person, and she has a lot of humility and a lot of strong opinions. So she's worthy to know for who and what she is. So what is her process of liberation that we have an opportunity to learn from? It's threefold. Not surprising, right? Very Trinitarian. The first component of this process of liberation is called the presence of God in the soul. This is a foundational truth to her. You can't walk her way. You can't be one of her daughters. If you're going to ascribe to her writings, this is the foundational truth that needs to be there if you're going to open to that. The second is the progressive interiorization of the soul. She has a very strong belief that the soul is in movement to union, and that the progress, if you are to talk about progress, she moves away from progress. In the beginning, she encourages you to mark progress because it helps you, it builds encouragement and morale. Towards the end, she encourages you to move away from noting progress because the progress is the movement of the soul interiorly. And the third part of that process of liberation is the profound union with God in the center. This is the end. So you have the foundation, you have the movement, and you have the end. She says in her introduction to the interior castle, I'm just going to read this. It's fun to hear her words, so hopefully you can feel her. There is no reason to tire ourselves in trying to comprehend the beauty of this castle. She says that our soul and our beingness is a castle in this later version. She doesn't in her earlier version. Since this castle is a creature, and the difference, therefore, between it and God is the same as that between the creator and the creature, that His Majesty, in saying that the soul is made in His own image, makes it almost impossible for us to understand the sublime dignity and beauty of the soul. So in one long run-in sentence, she says that the castle is a creature, and yet at the center of the castle is the creator. And that the soul is simultaneously made in the image and likeness of the creator, and yet is as different as the creator is to all creation. And because of this sublime dilemma, it is almost impossible to understand the dignity and the beauty of our own souls. So in one stroke, we're let off the hook. Especially the Western psyche puts such a big load on our shoulders to understand that we have to be responsible and we have to understand, and then apply our understanding. So in one stroke, we're let off the hook because it's impossible to understand this dignity and beauty. And at the other is the evocative hook that we will never be satisfied unless we discover, not intellectually, not emotionally, but experientially, the dignity and the beauty of our souls. And in that very tension, we engage the process of liberation. She goes on to say, it is a shame and unfortunate that through our own fault, we don't understand ourselves or know who we are. Wouldn't it show great ignorance, my daughters, if someone, when asked who he was, didn't know, and didn't know his father or mother, or from what country he came? Well now, if this would be so extremely stupid, we are, sorry, she makes me laugh. We are incomparably more so when we do not strive to know who we are, but limit ourselves to considering only roughly these bodies. Because we have heard and we have been told and we taste something that we know we have souls. But we seldom consider the precious things that can be found in this soul, or who dwells within it, or its high value. Consequently, little effort is made to preserve its beauty. All our attention is taken up with the plainness of the diamond setting or the outer wall of the castle. You will find in all of her teachings, she starts from this premise, the beauty and the dignity of our souls and the indwelling spirit. Now there, I'm going to give you just a little technical language, and then we'll move back into the experiential. when she says these things, she's very realistic. She's very practical, very practical. She is not speaking metaphorically or symbolically. She is speaking as it is reality. And there are three qualities to presence. One is active presence, one is objective presence, and one is the localization of objective presence. I'm not going to get heady after I speak to these because it touches a little on this dynamic invitation that's ours. What's meant by active presence is the reference that what is a pure spirit? What is a pure spirit can be understood in relation to the world, that spirit has presence because it is active. For instance, let's say you feel the presence of Teresa right now in spirit. You feel her right here. That felt presence is an active presence because it is actively right here. So when she speaks about the indwelling spirit, when she speaks about this mechanism of the soul, she is pointing to her faith fueled by direct experience. She's by her faith that there is the creative soul source actively present at all moments at the center of the being. It cannot not be so, period. We can rely upon it, we can trust it, we can surrender to it, we can wrestle that it's not there. But from what she is saying, even when we're wrestling with a doubt about this possibility, it is in relation to the reality that it is so right there. An objective presence, then, is the relationship of the soul with this active presence. And the localization is that it takes place in the innermost parts of the being. So objectivity points to the subtlety of source. That if source is actively present, there is a subtlety to how it is objectively so in the being. And here we're talking about ourselves, in the being. And in this subtlety, there's a localization that happens. So while there is a universality, there's a localization. This is really important to understand. So no more technicalities from there. And I know that would be a whole other course to talk about these things. What this does is it lets her communicate her reality that we're called to be and use all of what we are in this process. We're not called to surrender into an experience of God, if you will, by moving away from the faculties, by not using the mind, by not having the heart engaged, but rather we're called to harness the localization, harness all of these faculties into the movement, the progressive interiorization that leads to union with God. And when there is a unitive experience that seems to not be involving the faculties, it is because the union itself suspends the faculties. So there would have been popular movements in her time because there was a lot of ecstasy happening. There was a lot of levitation and bilocation and visions and imaginations and all of these things happening. There would have been a lot of that. And in the deliciousness of that, it would be tempting to want to have the experience by forcing the suspension of your own faculties. For who among us, when we experience blissful union, wants it to stop? We want it to keep on. So while it's futile, oftentimes the efforts can be to suspending the use of all the faculties when we are not being suspended. But what she speaks to in this progressive interiorization is that as we harness the faculties into the movement, very subtly, in almost imperceptible ways, except for the dramatic moments, very subtly, we begin to be filled. So the beauty and dignity of the soul begins to expand and take up on a cellular level the wholeness of what we are. And then what happens is we are informed. The intelligence of the field is the very intelligence in which we live and move and have our being. She was one to de-emphasize practice of specific actions to lean into the practice of a spiritual life, to see your whole life as a movement into union with God. And she sees the quest as one to know God. And in light of that progressive movement, to know self in light of God. Let yourself sit with that. So this liberation process is the process of knowing God intimately. Knowing God. Ultimately by emerging in union, knowing God. And then knowing self in light of God. To see with the Creator's eyes from the very center of who and what we are. And as that process happens, if we were to speak psychologically, the unconscious that is still awakening into this knowing moves into consciousness, and love casts out all that fear, because the illumination itself offers the consolation and the satisfaction. I'll give you just a moment just to kind of rest into that process of liberation there. I want to read for you a little bit of how she describes this transforming union. It gives you a nice image of the reality she's pointing to. We might say that union is as if the ends of two wax candles were joined, so that the light they give is one. The wicks and the wax and the light are all one. Yet afterwards, the one candle can be perfectly well separated from the other, and the candles become two again, or the wick may be withdrawn from the wax. It takes a little bit to kind of digest that powerful image that she gives. You will find, I'm sure you have read her writings, but if you haven't, you will find very often she's saying it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. It's kind of like this. So what I'm pooling here of this threefold process of liberation is an extrapolation of what we see happening over and over again in her writings. In her early writings of her life, which I love so much, she likens this process to water. And she has 4 stages at that time that she describes. But I'll give you an overview. I'm not going to give you the 4 stages. You can read that yourself, but I'll give you a sense of it. So there is the acknowledgement that water is really lovely and it satisfies the tongue and it gives energy and it's a great thing. And in this thirst that's identified, the individual then says, okay, well, what do I need to do to get more water? And it would be like someone living off the land. What would they do? They would dig for water. Or if there was a water source, they would go with a bucket and go fill their bucket with water and bring it back. And she likens this process, this practice of the spiritual life, as the consistency and the habit of going for the water and going for the water and going for the water. And then what happens, and we see this happen in evolution all the time. What happens is at a certain point when we're going for the water, we realize, well, wow, if I built a duct system, I wouldn't have to walk so far and take so long to get water. So we apply ourselves with the inspiration that motivates us to build the duct system. And when we build the duct system, then water flows to us. There's greater ease, but the light came from the practice of the spiritual life. She mentions that sometimes those insights come and we jump the progress, right? Immediately already we're just drinking the water. Well, as the process goes on, eventually, because still this is a very mundane process to wait for water to come down a duct system, it takes time. It doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes the flow varies. That in the process of this liberation, there comes a point when the water is brought to the beloved instantly, effortlessly. And that this experience is not for the few, but it is part of our essential nature. It's part of that being wired for God. So we harness and then we move in that direction. And she, as you well know, is incredibly audacious in her path, in her writings, and in her very being. In fact, I was at one of the monasteries, can't remember which one, and I learned that because one of her relatives, who was a cousin and was heading one of the other monasteries, did something that was out of integrity, and she simply ended the relationship with them. They got into a fight. She stood her ground on what was aligned and what was most of truth, and the relationship ended. She was somebody that suffered that degree of fidelity, and very simply and straightly. Here's another poem of hers. When my mouth touched God's, I became invisible, the way the earth would if the sun took it into its arms. The ecstatic death I know. What can touch God's exquisite form is not anything that can be seen. How do we make love to God? How does the soul make love to God? How does the soul make love to God? The heart has divine instincts. It just needs to be turned loose in the sky. Does not every angel know where God lives and will beat on God's door all night if it is locked? When my mouth touched God's, I became invisible, the way the earth would if the sun took it into its arms. So it's time for our share. I'm going to turn the recording off.